The world of Star Trek is, in many ways, like our own world. Sure, it's set in space in the distant future when technology has made many of mankind's worries obsolete, but generally speaking, it's a world of institutions, cultures, and habits that would be precisely identical to our own, if not for some creative costumes, special effects, and facial prosthetics. At least that was the case until May 5th, 1989, when an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation aired called Q Who, because in that episode was introduced an alien race so alien, so unsettling, that it not only changed the franchise forever, but influenced the entire genre of science fiction for decades to come. That race is the Borg, and to me, they represent the highest artistic achievement in the franchise, and a high watermark for Star Trek generally. So in this video, we're going to take a closer look at how the story of the Borg has unfolded since they were first introduced. And we'll pose the question of whether later installments in the Star Trek universe have succeeded in preserving their legacy. I must say, there's nothing else in the entire TNG series quite like the first moment the crew of the Enterprise D encounters the Borg.
Magnify.
If you don't remember the context, the crew has just been flung 7,000 light years into an unknown area of space by the omnipotent being Q. His reasons are not yet clear, but he seems to want to give Captain Picard a preview of the challenges that await humanity in the unexplored regions of the galaxy. The Borg are revealed as an image on the view screen of the Enterprise bridge, and it's really their vessel that makes the first impression. Counterintuitively, and unlike any other alien ship design ever seen before, it's a perfect cube. It has no particular design, nothing that would indicate any culture or aesthetic beyond raw utility. And there's just something deeply unnerving about that right off the bat. I actually remember being 6 years old when this episode first aired and feeling pretty frightened by the idea. I guess I'm already hinting at one of my main arguments in this video, which is that the Borg perhaps belong more to the genre of horror than they do to that of science fiction. These aren't mutually exclusive, of course, and they complement each other quite nicely, but the Borg have a particular quality of terror that I think is really interesting and which is in some ways counterintuitive. Who would think, after all, that something that's geometrically perfect would be unsettling? Why would an innocent cube instill more fear than a ship that has a conspicuous array of weapons or which behaves aggressively? And I think the writers of this episode just really understood the particular type of fear they were working with when they introduced the Borg, because the ship initially does not threaten them. It doesn't open fire. It doesn't try to capture them. It just kind of looms over them as if in silent waiting. There's a primal terror lurking here, like a fear of the dark, a sense that Picard and his crew should turn back now. And in fact, he's warned to do exactly that. But in keeping with his Federation ideals and his belief that all life is fundamentally equal, he engages with them as he would any other new potential friend and ally. The horror continues as we get our first glimpse of a Borg drone who appears in engineering. He poses no immediate threat and is more interested in downloading information from the engineering console than infiltrating the ship. This is still, of course, unacceptable, and the drone is destroyed, only to be replaced by another who apparently has no regard for his fallen brother. Turns out the Borg are a collective, meaning the drones have no individual identity and think as a single hive mind. Now, there are many cultural influences that one could point to as inspiration for this cybernetic destruction of the self. The work of H.R. Giger is often cited here as a visual influence. And there are plenty of half-man, half-machine characters previous to the Borg. But you'd have to dig pretty deep in the pulp sci-fi section to find anything like biological assimilation and networked consciousness. And it's probably not a coincidence that the Borg were conceived in a time when the internet was just beginning to enter the public imagination. Science fiction had long explored the cyborgification of the human race, but seldom the dangers of digital networks specifically. And as the internet tightened its grip on our society in the ensuing 10 years, science fiction adapted to explore this nascent cultural anxiety. The Matrix is certainly the most fully realized expression of this particular fear, and the film clearly draws heavily from the Borg. Though one interesting thing about the Borg is that they weren't originally intended to be cyborgs, producer Maurice Hurley explains that the idea came from insect mentality. They wanted to create an insectoid race that consumed their enemies relentlessly with no regard for how many of their own individuals had to be sacrificed. The only reason they pivoted to the humanoid cyborgs is that they didn't have the necessary production budget to create a believable insect race. But the Borg did retain much of their insecty origins. And again, the Matrix picked up on this natural parallel and developed it further. Now, the point of the episode Q Who is that Q wants to disabuse Picard of his arrogance. So, in the end, after it becomes clear that the Enterprise is outmatched by the Borg, Q snaps his fingers and flings them back to their original coordinates. But the episode ends on an ominous note, as Picard realizes that it's only a matter of time before the Borg enter Federation space, and this teases the next appearance of the Borg, the epic two-part cliffhanger, The Best of Both Worlds, which was a major television event in the 1990s. Now, you might not have noticed this, but the writers made one important change to the Borg between these two appearances. In Q Who, the Borg seem to be primarily interested in harvesting the technology of other races, and they don't seem in any particular hurry to do so. In Best of Both Worlds, they seem much more interested in biological assimilation and seem to behave as if they have a much more specific and deliberate military intent. They're specifically targeting Earth, and they capture and assimilate Captain Picard so that he can represent the Borg when they invade. Now, I leave it to you, dear viewer, to tell me, does this make the Borg more or less scary than they were in Q Who? Actually, I'd like you to keep that question before your mind for the rest of the video. Certainly, the assimilation of Picard introduces a whole new level of horror and challenges his character in a really important way. And the wake of destruction that they leave on their warpath to planet Earth is certainly intimidating. But does this new and more purposeful vision of the Borg undermine the very thing that made them such a menace in the previous episode? Whatever your answer, I'm sure we can agree that this episode is certainly one of the best in the franchise. And even if the Borg are less scary, perhaps that's the entire point. We should remember that despite all of their technological and military superiority, in the end, their greatest strength is also their greatest weakness. Because one of the unintended consequences of assimilating Picard into the collective is that he learned all of their tactical weaknesses and was able to easily access a subroutine to put them all asleep, leaving their ship vulnerable. And the moral of the story seems to be that while there are indeed advantages in the perfect efficiency of collective consciousness, there are also other advantages in knowledge being distributed among individuals. And this theme will be explored much later, as we'll see. But of course, the real legacy of The Best of Both Worlds is that it changes Picard for the rest of his life. The trauma of having his body and individuality so profoundly violated never really leaves him. And that is an aspect of the Borg that is not really explored in Q Who, and it really does deepen the horror of what they are. In some ways, assimilation is a fate worse than death, and it raises unsettling questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Makes you kind of wonder, does the listless Borg drone remember any part of his individual identity from before he was assimilated? Does any part of his soul remain intact after his mind is subsumed into the hive? And actually, this question is posed. Picard is actually asked how much of the experience he remembers, and he says, everything. And that might be the most terrifying thing of all, the idea that assimilation is something like anesthesia awareness. It's a rare phenomenon in which patients undergoing surgery are consciously awake and only physically paralyzed by anesthetic. Now, it's my personal opinion that the Borg are never really scarier than they are at this early stage in their development. In many ways, The Best of Both Worlds is the culmination of their story. The assimilation of Picard and its consequences delivers on their primary narrative promise. Picard's ideas of individuality and peaceful diplomacy are challenged, but in the end, he prevails, with the moral being that the benefits of individualism ultimately outweigh the benefits of collective thought. So, the question going forward for the writers was, where do we go from here? What narrative questions are left to be posed by the Borg? And really, the main question left unanswered is whether individual Borg have any vestige of personal identity left. Because if they do, then there's an argument to be made that they're slaves of the collective rather than mere drones. And that introduces a new moral question to be developed and explored. That new thread is introduced in the episode I, Borg, in which the Enterprise rescues an injured Borg drone, and in keeping with their Federation principles of respecting all life, they nurse him back to health. He begins to show clear signs of autonomy and even names himself Hugh. Even Picard, who's naturally skeptical, begins to believe that Hugh is genuinely self-aware. A Starfleet command sees potential to use Hugh as a weapon by using him to plant a virus that would destroy the collective if he's reassimilated. And so the moral question of this episode is whether this act of biological warfare would constitute an act of genocide. So there's a brilliant moral inversion at play here. If the Federation destroys the entire Borg civilization, are they any better than the Borg? Is there maybe some biological chauvinism going on here? It's a fascinating question. But in the end, Hugh returns to the collective of his own volition in order to protect his new friends from assimilation. And the episode ends with the suggestion that even though no virus was communicated to the collective, Hugh's sense of his own individuality might nonetheless have an effect. This is paid off in the final episode of TNG to feature the Borg, another two-part cliffhanger called Descent. Hugh's sense of individuality has spread to other Borg drones, creating a splinter cell outside of the collective. Despite their newfound autonomy, they find a savior in Data's evil twin, Lore, who has plans to create a new race of perfect beings. Now, this subplot about Hugh and the Splinter Borg colony is really the first time that the Borg are portrayed as sympathetic. And this is where things kind of start to get complicated. From this point on, most of the Borg stories are less about the threat that they pose and much more about the struggle for individuality, with one huge exception. Descent is the last episode in TNG to feature the Borg, but of course, it's not the last time that the crew of the Enterprise would encounter them. First Contact, the second motion picture based on the TNG series, is the Borg's biggest moment in the pop culture spotlight. And this story is not especially concerned with the ethical questions of individual Borg autonomy. This movie is in some ways a retread of Best of Both Worlds. It leans heavily on Picard's assimilation for its dramatic weight, and it brings the Borg back to Sector 001 for yet another terrestrial invasion. But this film makes one huge addition to Borg canon, and that is the introduction of the Borg Queen. Not quite their leader, but certainly a personification of the collective, meant to help the movie-going audience put a face to the Borg threat. Now, we can debate the necessity and merits of this decision. Certainly it helps if your movie has a personified villain, though it's not strictly necessary. See Lord of the Rings. But in any case, the Borg Queen represents probably the most dramatic shift in how the Borg are presented in the franchise going forward. They come across less as the monolithic collective consciousness and much more like the action movie villain. But I will say there's one very interesting new idea introduced into Borg lore in this film, and that's the idea that it feels good to be part of the collective. In other words, that the assimilation of self into shared consciousness brings a sense of sublime belonging and unity, a fundamental human yearning that cannot otherwise be achieved. You see some of this in the Queen's temptation of Data, whom she tempts with the offer of making his machine body partially organic. For the Queen, the distinction between man and machine is superficial, and eliminating the distinction even has an erotic suggestion. And this is, by the way, very much in keeping with H.R. Giger's vision of the biomechanical. This does add an interesting layer of psychological depth to the Borg, which is picked up in later episodes of the Star Trek franchise, which for the most part you'll find in the series Voyager. There are some references to the Borg in Deep Space Nine, but Voyager features the Borg much more prominently, with even more Borg-focused episodes than TNG, which we'll come back to. Now, the Borg made sense for Voyager for two reasons. First, the ship is stranded in the Delta Quadrant, part of which is Borg space. And second, the show needed a ratings boost, and the Borg were the most popular villains in the franchise at that time. They are introduced in the third season when Chakotay discovers a Borg colony that has become disconnected from the collective. They try to build their own society, but their newfound autonomy leads to conflict as the distinct alien races, now de-Borged, take up old interspecies grudges. And it's only by reestablishing their own collective consciousness that they're able to find unity and peace. I think it's one of the few episodes of Star Trek that I know of that makes an argument against diversity and individuality, the idea being that this group can only survive if they conform to a singular way of thinking. Maybe the Borg aren't so bad after all. But the Borg really make their first splash in the two-part episode Scorpion, in which it's revealed that the Borg are at war with an even stronger alien race dubbed Species 8472. They have a uniquely resilient biology that makes them immune to assimilation. They also have the advantage of being biologically integrated with their technology, so there's no real distinction between their bodies and their vessels, which is a kind of riff on the original insectoid concept of the Borg. Captain Janeway sees this as an opportunity to form an alliance with the Borg so that she can traverse Borg space on her way back to the Alpha Quadrant. And this is how we meet the first Borg main character in the franchise, Seven of Nine. Much of the fourth season of Voyager is about her struggles to adapt to her new life as an individual member of the crew. In fact, many of the most consequential episodes of Voyager from this point on are about Seven of Nine and her relationship with the Borg collective. In the show's fifth season, the Borg Queen is reintroduced as a recurring character, and we get to see the Unit Complex, which is a kind of Borg headquarters. One of the more interesting storylines in the series involves a Borg rebellion caused by a genetic mutation that allows some drones to inhabit a secret dream world called Unimatrix Zero. But again, this is kind of a retread of the Hugh storyline from The Next Generation. Same goes for the final episode, in which Voyager uses a Borg transwarp hub to travel back to Federation space. This is where the Borg Queen meets her demise for the second time, and not for the last. Now, in my view, once we get to the series Picard, the Borg have been effectively played out. We've exhausted all of the narrative and thematic possibilities of their story. And because they're now the most recognizable villain in Star Trek, they've unfortunately become a kind of crutch for a lack of new ideas. That's not to say that the Borg should not have played some part in exploring the later years of Picard's life, but I'm not exactly sure what the intent was with the Borg artifact in Season 1, nor of the return of the Borg Queen in Season 2. Even Season 3, which I enjoyed quite a bit more, had a plotline involving Borg DNA being passed on to his son, Jack Crusher, as part of some nefarious plot to infiltrate the Federation once again. Regardless of how you felt about that series, I think the point is pretty clear that we've come a long, long way from the Borg we met in Q Who. And in my view, much of the thing that made them so interesting and scary to begin with gradually faded away as Star Trek became over-reliant on them as a bankable villain. I said earlier that I think the Borg story is more horror than science fiction, and that's because the more we learn about the Borg, the less compelling and interesting they are. It's that classic thing, it's sometimes called the Jaws effect, where a monster is only scary when it's lurking unseen. Once all of its subtlety and complexity has been revealed and understood, it no longer has the capacity to instill terror. To be clear, I don't fault the writers and producers of Star Trek for fully exhausting the potential of the Borg. The moral questions about individual identity at the heart of the Borg story are still worth asking, and one could argue that there's still questions left to be answered. One interesting thing is that the Borg aren't technically even a species. Each drone was once a member of some alien race. Even the Borg Queen herself says that she was a member of species 125. So one big question remains, how did the Borg start? Maybe it was some hapless race of humanoids who thought it would be a good idea to integrate AI into their society without taking safety precautions. In any case, looking back on that first Borg episode, you really have to marvel at the level of imagination that went into their creation. It was still early in the development of the TNG series, and the cast and crew were still figuring out who the characters were and what the show was all about. The legacy of the Borg might actually be pretty deep. It certainly gave Star Trek a kind of gravitas that wasn't always there in some of the more episodic adventures it was known for. And it gave Jean-Luc Picard a character arc that continued throughout the entire series and beyond. But when I take a step back and reflect on how the Borg affected me as a young viewer and then as a lifelong fan, it was really the idea that sometimes, despite all your best intentions and despite all the goodwill you might have for others, sometimes there is just no answer to the evil that confronts you. Or maybe even scarier, it's not the evil that confronts you, it's the unrelenting inevitability of things. You will conform to a system. You are part of a collective. And the long arc of technological progress does not tend towards freedom, but towards the psychological enslavement of humanity and the destruction of the individual. You will be assimilated. All else is irrelevant. Resistance is futile. And more than all the biomechanical horror and the monolithic spaceships, that spirit of inevitable self-destruction in the name of technological perfection, that is what makes the Borg the scariest alien race ever imagined. So thank you for watching. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support this channel, and I'll see you on the next one.